In today's World Insight, former U.S. President Donald Trump in hot water, facing 34 counts of felony charges after being indicted in a New York Manhattan court. What does it mean to be the first former U.S. president accused in a criminal case? Could the case deepen the raucous partisan divide in America?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's legal troubles mount after his indictment on Tuesday in Manhattan court in New York. He was charged with 34 counts of felony for falsifying records to hide hush money paid to an adult film star before his 2016 campaign. He pleaded not guilty to all the charges. Trump is the first former U.S. president to face criminal prosecution. So what's next for Trump and his legal defense? How far could Trump's case deepen America's political divide? For answers, let's loop in our panelists. I'm joined in Washington, D.C., Bruce Fein, constitutional lawyer, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and the General Counsel of the Federal Communication Commission under President Reagan. Meanwhile, joining us is Spencer Critchley, two-time Obama campaign advisor and author of the book, Patriots of Two Nations. In Beijing, Rick Dunham, director of the Global Business Journalism Program with Tsinghua University. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. First of all, go to you, Spencer, about exactly what is the nature that you see is taking place regarding Mr. Trump's future.
Well, I think most importantly, this is a test of our constitutional democracy. And I think that anybody, no matter where they stand on the indictment of Mr. Trump, should be rooting for democracy to function the way it was originally designed by James Madison and the other authors of the Constitution. In particular, it's putting, two key principles in tension with each other: the separation of powers and the rule of law, which states that no person is above the law.
Bruce, your thoughts?
Well, I would agree, and I would amplify just a little. This particular indictment I think you're referring to, the 34 felony counts charged against Mr. Trump, in a broad sense, paying hush money to mistresses to influence, with the intent to influence the outcome of the 2016 election by hiding some of his more depraved habits, is not a crime that really relates to the survival of the country, like the peaceful transfer of presidential power, which is at stake in the January 6th insurrection, is at stake in the Georgia investigation concerning trying to solicit a Georgia Secretary of State to find 11,700 new votes to change the outcome of the election. So in terms of the seriousness of the crime, it isn't at the peak level. But surely in this particular instance, like others, we want to make sure that Mr. Trump gets no more or less fair treatment as anyone else.
Rick, you've been covering Washington for decades. Now, from your perspective as a journalist, what is the nature of what is taking place right now?
Well, I have two thoughts on that. One is that I'm just in awe of the historical importance of where we are right now. This is the first time in the history of the Republic that a president or former president has been charged with a crime. And as Bruce said, this is not the most serious alleged crime that Donald Trump committed. Trying to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power or trying to steal an election after he had lost it are much more important to the fundamentals of democracy. But the basic principle that everyone the law applies equally to everyone is significant. And in this case, I want to amplify what Bruce said in one way. The charges are not just tied to the presidential election and trying to cover up something that could be embarrassing before the election. It also is tax fraud, that he falsified records to cheat on taxes. And there's a long history of prosecutors using tax fraud to get people that they couldn't get on other charges, the most famous being Al Capone, the gangster in Chicago, who ended up being convicted on tax-related charges rather than mass murder for his reign.
How much of this, Spencer, looking at what is going on inside the country, and you are the author of the latest book describing two nations, in fact, within one country. Tell me more about how is this reflecting about partisan differences or division within the country? You also see that as a result of this indictment of Mr. Trump, and the country is becoming ever more.
Yes. Well, the point of my book actually is that I don't think it nearly captures the situation to think of it just in terms of the traditional left versus right partisan divide within our liberal democracy. And in fact, what we're seeing here is a more fundamental division between two completely different worldviews and two different visions of what the United States is supposed to be. And that's what I mean by patriots of two nations. The two sides consider themselves deeply patriotic, but they're patriotic to two very different visions of what America is. And a short way of describing that difference is, one vision is a civic nation founded in ideas, and that's the version of America coming out of the Enlightenment and the theory of social contract and that sort of thing, where anybody can be an American, was the theory at least, as long as you believe in those ideas. And it doesn't matter what your religion is, your culture, your race, none of that matters as long as you support the Constitution. But the other vision is more of an ethnic nation, where it's more about an expression of national identity rooted in culture and for some people, race. Also, not so much under the rule of reason as under the rule of faith, whether that's religious faith or other forms of faith, for example, nationalistic faith. So really, that's the contest we're seeing here. And in my view, Donald Trump is exploiting ethnic nationalist passions the way many demagogues always have, and exacerbating a divide that was already there.
How do you see this is likely to impact the political timetable of of campaigns toward the election? What might this mean for the Republican Party that is searching for candidates?
I think it guarantees chaos in the Republican primaries. For one thing, the judge said that the next hearing of this is December, which is 1 month before Republicans in Iowa go to their caucuses to pick the first delegates for the Republican presidential selection. And so it guarantees that there will be at least one trial with Donald Trump, unless these charges are thrown out by the judge, that's going on as he is being selected for the Republican nomination. And remember, this might not be his first trial. If he is charged in Georgia, in the case that Bruce alluded to, if he is charged either for the cover-up of stealing classified documents in Mar-a-Lago or for his role in January 6th, those could be going on too. So I think it guarantees chaos. And it also means that Donald Trump will be front and center in the Republican primaries, which is bad for anyone else who wants to be the nominee. I think it's particularly bad for the governor of Florida, who's in a tough position of defending Trump at the same time he's trying to distance himself from Trump. And someone like Mike Pence, who just can't get oxygen right now, his former vice president who wants to run for president. So I think it'll be fascinating. Again, Donald Trump is a man unlike any in American politics, political history. And I think that this next presidential election will be unlike any in American presidential history.
Bruce, you served in the Republican administration. Tell me more about your thoughts on this.
Well, the most close analogy, really, and I served at the time of President Richard Nixon and Watergate. And one thing that was striking about that case, it was true he didn't get indicted, but he would have got indicted absent a pardon, was that everyone who stuck to him to the 11th hour was defeated in the next election. And the lesson from that experience is that these people who are sticking with Trump, in my view, that the Republicans will be slaughtered in 2024 if justice is done. And I expect we will find guilty verdicts and Trump will be disgraced because the American people still have shown an attachment to the idea of the rule of law as being our trademark.
Well, there are a lot of things going on besides the indictment of Mr. Trump, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world. For example, the U.S. economy, and also about the an apparent spreading new Cold War, quote unquote. So how do you see the uncertainties this indictment is likely to add to both the approval attitudes of the public toward the Biden administration, and how much do you see the administration right now will be able to concentrate on issues related to the ultimate interests of the United States? Of course, you could argue rule of law and Constitution is always the ultimate interest of the United States, but besides that, how do you see this is likely to shed a light on what is going on with the current administration?
It seems to me, I think the issues are a little bit separated politically.
Sure.
I don't think the Biden administration, they're not gloating, they're largely silent. They're not benefiting directly from the travails of Mr. Trump. And I do think that the points that you made are excellent because there are no good answers. We are in terrible economic shape because the only way we can stop inflation is to hike interest rates. And that causes the value of all the treasury bonds that these banks own, including out of China, to become like worth half what their face value is. For the first time in history, our Federal Reserve Board now has lost $42 billion in the value of assets it has. It's literally bankrupt. And there's no way that these banks can be readily saved without, unless we have another huge bailout, which causes more inflation.
All right. Go to you, Rick. You've been living in the U.S. and also in China long time, of course. So tell me more about your angle of looking at the indictment of Mr. Trump this time vis-a-vis the big general environment that we are talking about.
Well, I think in the United States, I don't think it's had a huge political impact one way or another. I hate to look at polls week by week, but Joe Biden's poll number has ticked up a little bit. I don't think it's significant. The public approval of Donald Trump really didn't change at all one way or another. Globally, I think the most important thing that people are worrying about or thinking about is, does Donald Trump become president again? Would he radically change the direction of American foreign policy? And does he have a chance to get elected? I think right now we would say no. But if you remember our discussions back in 2016, all the pundits were saying that Trump wasn't going to get elected then. So I'm afraid to make that prediction for 2024.
Of course, Spencer, you specifically described that situation in the green room with the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton during her campaign. Of course, I don't want to describe that situation again, but just from your perspective, how is this background that I just described internationally and regarding the U.S. economy, which is the ultimate interest and the strength of the U.S. in front of the world, actually is likely to be impacted by the internal atmosphere? I think that is very interesting for all of us in the rest of the world.
You know, I think that the best thing that can happen for the United States really is the kind of thing that many countries, including the United States, consider very awkward, which is for people to watch us struggle to adhere with our own values. That can be reinforcing of faith in democracy, I believe. When we have failed to live up to our own professed values, that has been very damaging, and we have done that a number of times over the years. The values we profess, though, are inspiring to people around the world and remain inspiring to the extent that we show that we mean it. So I think that if the Biden administration continues the way I believe it has, as has been described, to not gloat, to give no appearance of seeking to benefit from Mr. Trump's legal troubles, and on the international stage, to bring us back to that values-based but also realistic international policy. For example, in the relationship with China, of course, there are tensions in the relationship with China, but our relationship with China has been much better than it has been now, even with some very fundamental differences in outlook. I think at the moment, there's a risk of indulging in that nationalistic intensity on both sides, frankly, where politicians score points by fanning nationalistic pride or nationalistic resentment. And to the extent the Biden administration can return us to a world where, yes, we advocate for our values, but we also show that we can listen, and we also don't surrender to these nationalistic gestures and the fanning of nationalistic passion, because that just makes it harder for both sides to negotiate. And, they become beholden to their own populations that they have fired up. So I think that that's our best hope going forward, is to live up to our values, show that we mean them, advocate for them around the world, but avoid being divisive or nationalistic where we don't need to be.
One of the things that's very interesting for many analysts is the symbol that Donald Trump seems to stand for. That is a kind of politician, or people who turned eventually into politician, as he was, be able to manipulate politics and also be able to use some of the most divisive issues of the country and even of the world. For example, his relationship with the president of Russia, for political gains. Now, how do you see he's actually impacting on the styles of politics in the United States during his administration and likely even today? Bruce.
Well, he certainly lowered the standards. I think that Mr. Trump has taken, narcissism to a new level. There's nothing to which he wouldn't stoop in terms of degrading people, women, the disabled, immigrants. You're all rapists. You're all coming in with drugs. I don't like you. I wouldn't have a sex with you.
But one of the things it needs to bear in mind is he was doing this with the expectation that he will win more political support, not only from his base, probably even more in the general public. That is the interesting phenomenon. So he's not a phenomenon of one person, but rather a phenomenon that...
You're exactly right. Remember, Mr. Trump was a Democrat. He was a pro-choice Democrat before he became a Republican. So he changed because he understood the culture had changed. He understood there would be receptivity to this appeal to the lowest common denominator, if you will. And the votes show that to a large degree, he has succeeded. Now, I still don't think he's got a majority. I think it's very, very worrisome that he still has this very large base that's totally unhinged and removed from reality and simply want to display their self-identity by degrading and belittling other people. And we're number one. And, like a teenager, I can better than you. I can sock you in the nose. And Mr. Trump has reduced politics to that level. Even his speech last night at Mar-a-Lago reflected the same.
Rick?
Well, I think the significance of Donald Trump is not his outrageous rhetoric or his sort of P.T. Barnum salesmanship. I think it's his impact on the Republican Party. You look right now, the loudest voices are all Trump champions, and some of them are very extreme. Congresswoman named Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, who has talked about, has been anti-Semitic and racist, and she was the one at the courthouse with protesters. If you look at the leaders who in the House who are investigating Joe Biden and the Biden family and anything Democratic, Donald Trump has a hold on the loudest voices, and his critics have been almost silenced. I mean, think of Liz Cheney, who not only was defeated, but in presidential polls is 1%, 2%. Even his former vice president, who stuck with him all the way, but in the end believed in the rule of law, well, he's polling maybe 5% for president. So these people who were the mainstream conservative voices have been largely marginalized within the Republican Party. And I think that's the significance of Donald Trump. He has a hold on one of the two major parties in the United States right now. And the question is, how long will that last?
Very interesting. Spencer?
Yes, I think that Donald Trump is much more of an opportunistic figure than a personally transformative figure. I think that he just exploited a trend that was already well underway. I also think there were very few people who saw this coming, even though it looked so obvious in retrospect, and I count myself among those people. There was virtually a consensus in the Western democracies that, as Francis Fukuyama put it in his famous book in the 90s, we had reached the end of history with liberal democracy. We would still disagree about the tax rate and the size of government and this sort of thing, but we had a broad consensus that liberal democracy was the solution to history. And pretty much at that moment, it appeared that we had reached a peak, and there was this ethnic nationalist resurgence predicted by Samuel Huntington, an American foreign affairs expert at the time, who was roundly criticized for making those comments at the time. But I think he was somewhat prescient. And I think that that's how deep this is right now. As I say, Donald Trump is opportunistic of a trend that's rooted in this reaction of ethnic nationalism against the sort of global liberal democratic order. Also the effects, first of all, of mass media, and then very fragmented mass media, first of all through talk radio, then cable television, and then the internet and social media. And these are all, forces that we did not understand well before we unleashed them. And now we're scrambling to try to understand them and catch up. All of this, I think, has come together to put democracy, which was, it was created at the time, in the time of the printing press, when media was the newspaper, and there was no such thing even as a telegraph. And we're having to cope with this resurgence of ethnic nationalism, the effects of this incredibly different and fragmented media landscape, which now has us in a situation where people are able to live inside their own virtual realities, not just split left to right, but split between completely different ways of experiencing the world and thinking about how you define truth, for example. And Trump is an opportunistic figure who waded into essentially, I think, a vacuum where there used to be a rough moral consensus as to what America was supposed to be, and filled that vacuum with what we've seen happen in the last few years.
Before we go, another question, a very realistic question. Do you expect more violence as a result of what is going on with Mr. Trump and his base in the country? Do you see something like that of the congressional violence that we have seen in the U.S. Likely to repeat again? And how do you see various factors of the government and society are trying to avoid, quote unquote, yesterday once more? Bruce?
Well, I don't think there's going to be violence. I think, at least with regard to Mr. Trump. It doesn't mean we won't have the gun violence in Tennessee. That's going to continue. They are for 15s are celebrated, but at least the response to the indictment indicate that deterrence works, that everyone's taken a lesson from what's happened to the participants in January 6th. Even some of the more radicals have said, no, do not go out and protest and engage in violence.
But there are already reports of various calls for everything from targeted attacks on district attorney who brought the case to a new civil war, quote unquote, to other kinds of violence among Trump's base.
But they didn't show up and do that. That happened when we know what happened.
Well, if they do that, it's already too late, isn't it?
They can summon the violence, but no one shows up. And there has not been an attack on the district attorney. There has not been an attack on the judge. You can expect this violent rhetoric, which is an earmark of Trump. It's easy to boast about it, but they still remember, where are the people on January 6th? They're in prison. They're in prosecution. and they don't want to go there.
All right. Rick?
Well, wait, I agree with you on this one. I think that there is a chance that something terrible will happen. I mean, America has a history of sporadic political violence, not like in a country like India, but we've had congresswomen and congressmen shot over the past 15 years, and you don't know what somebody who's impassioned will do if Donald Trump continues to stir up his base, or even on the other side, trying to make a point because of the availability of guns. But we have to hope that there's not any serious sporadic incident. I don't think there will be an uprising, but I do worry that there could be a crazy person on either extreme do something.
Spencer?
Yes, I agree. And I think that the arrests and trials have had a deterrent effect that punctured the bubble of many people living in a fantasy world who really, among those January 6th insurrectionists, many of them, who were taking selfies and posting to their Facebook accounts using their actual names, appeared to think they were in a TV show or a movie, which is an unfortunate characteristic of our media-saturated culture. I think it separates people from the world where there are actual consequences to your actions. And I think it's been a bracing experience to see that there still are consequences. However, I think we have to remain vigilant. And I think that, the Republican Party has a special responsibility. All parties have this responsibility, but at this moment, the Republican Party has a special responsibility they are failing to meet, which is to stop fanning this. I think it's actually originally a Chinese saying that if you ride the tiger, you can't dismount because the tiger may eat you. And I think the Republican Party is in that position. They've been stoking this kind of thing for a long time for electoral gain, thinking they could, pander to the extremists in their base without actually taking them seriously. But one of the things the internet has done is allowed those people to organize independent of the party, and the party has become increasingly irrelevant. And in many ways, the base has taken over the party. And it only takes a small minority of violent people to do an enormous amount of damage in a democracy. And I think that's what we have to remain vigilant about, and not just rely on law enforcement, but call on the Republicans, along with all parties, to fulfill their key function of being responsible stewards of the democratic process. Argue vigorously for your positions, but support democracy above all.
Spencer Critchley, Bruce Fine, and Rick Dunham. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Appreciate it. And that's all we have for today. You can find us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.